We are Highgate School and we're discussing whether we have a responsibility to abide by the terms of a dead person's will, even if doing so would come at a cost of the living. We believe that by default we are obliged to follow a dead person's will, but if doing so would come at a significantly great cost of the living, it would be morally permissible to ignore the will.
First of all, in abstract, do we have any responsibility to the dead?
It could be argued that we have no responsibility to the dead at all because they are no longer sentient and cannot be harmed. According to Mill's harm principle, we should look exclusively at what causes the least amount of harm, and since the dead cannot be physically or mentally harmed, their wishes do not need to be considered.
Existentialists adopt a similar view that the living have the ultimate freedom and responsibility to determine how to handle the legacy of the deceased. They shift the focus from rigid duty to authentic decision making in accordance with the values of the living, especially since the living are what keep society running, not the dead. And so we should place a higher importance on those whose decisions affect society today.
However, we believe that it is still possible to wrong the dead, for example, by spreading malicious lies about them with the intent of ruining their reputation. We believe that a will is a codified version of a person's autonomy and rational agency. And if we disregard this as soon as someone dies, we are committing wrongdoing against them.
The main reason we have responsibility to the dead is that wills can be viewed as posthumous promises to the dead. If we accept promises as binding, we have a duty to fulfill them, even after death, because by definition, a promise is a commitment that transcends the individual's current state. For example, let's say your friend is arrested and it looks like they'll be going to prison for a long time, so you promise to look after their children. Now, suppose they get a life sentence and say they'll never find out if you kept the promise or not. We don't think the promise suddenly becomes worthless. If you only keep a promise because you fear the consequences of breaking it, it wasn't really a promise to begin with.
Failing to keep our promises to the dead could have consequences for the living too. If we can't abide by our promises to the dead, then our promises to the living could also become devalued, and society could become full of distrust and dishonesty.
Furthermore, to deny people control over what is done with their possessions is to unjustly undermine the effort they put into accumulating and managing those possessions. It could even lead to a decreased desire to work hard among the living, because now people know that the moment they die, their worth as a person is disregarded.
One may pose the question, what if someone wanted to destroy their possessions that the living could have benefited from? For example, what if a deceased person states that they want to burn their personal valuable collection of art, which could have benefited culture for the public? We think this doesn't count as a cost to the living because the public never had access to the art in the first place. And while the idea of allowing someone to destroy their valuable possessions might seem uncomfortable, we are willing to bite the bullet. If it would be legal for someone to burn their possessions while alive, we see no reason why they can't do the same thing after death.
Fundamentally, we believe that trust and property rights is extremely important for society to function. If we set a precedent for ignoring the will of the dead to benefit the living, we could easily end up in a situation where the government raids the property of dead people in order to fund public services. This could severely undermine the integrity of society as people lose their motivation to work.
In conclusion, we believe that we do have a responsibility to abide by the will of the dead. Of course, we would not be obliged to do so if their instructions severely harmed the living, for example, if someone wanted to use their property to cause toxic pollution. But this is no different to whether a living person wanted to do this. The cost to the living should be considered in the same manner as if the deceased person was still alive.